Hi, this is Lou. Welcome to my channel. And today I've got some really simple watercolour ideas for you that are great if you're a beginner or if you just want something to get yourself started, to practice different brush strokes and to play with colours. So I've got a set of watercolours here, a palette that I've squeezed out some tube paints into. And these are absolutely fine and they'll dry in the palette. You can top them up at any point just by squeezing a bit more out of the tube. And then when you want to use them, you can just add a few drops of water onto each pan and reactivate them. I don't clean out my palette. I like to leave the mixing area really nice and messy, and then I can reuse those paints just by adding water to them and activating them again. So let's choose some brushes for today. I've got one of my usual pointed round brushes, and I think I'll have a play with a flat brush as well. That's got a nice square end, so it should be able to get me some different shapes on the page. And then I've cut up a few small sheets of watercolour paper, just little offcuts from larger sheets that I can use to practice things on. I've got some water, and I like to keep a paper towel on hand just in case I need to use it to mop up any paint or to dry my brush off. So let's start with a really simple exercise with that pointed round brush, and I'm just going to use it to test out my hand control really. I'm going to paint a spiral starting at the centre of the page. Just pick up a colour from my palette, and it happens to be this yellowy orange. And then I'm going to make the spiral go round, and as I go I'm going to go from using the tip of the brush. I'm going to try and draw the finest point possible, and sometimes it doesn't even hit the page and I have to go back and correct it, and then press my brush down so I get a really wide line, and I can wiggle it round to get myself some interesting shapes. And I'm going to try and not join my two areas together. So if I've got an area that kind of bumps out in the spiral, I'll try and leave a little bit of a gap between the colour that I'm painting now and the one that I did on the previous kind of rotation. And I'm really trying to vary the brush between very, very fine strokes and very, very thick ones. I'm also having a play with colour, moving between those kind of orangey, vibrant, almost yellowy colours through pinks and then into purples again. Sometimes I'm just dipping into the palette where I've got kind of random colours mingling in next to one another, and that helps the transitions of the colours. It helps them not really be kind of too strong, but they kind of softly transition from one colour into the next when you do that. You'll notice that on my palette I like to kind of keep different areas of roughly the same colour together, but I do like them to kind of mix, and you get all of these luscious kind of in-between colours. So I really like where the pink colour which I'm using, which is a Quinacridone Magenta, which is a really kind of hot pink. I really like it when it's kind of dulled down a little bit by little bits of the kind of the reddy orange colour. You could use any orange, but I've got a Quinacridone burnt orange, I think it's called, and little bits of kind of either a blue or a purpley colour will give you those kind of really vintage pink shades. And as I go I get more of a flow to my brush strokes. I feel a little bit more confident about lifting the brush up and placing it down. And I also notice where I struggle. most of the time I feel like I can go round the circle in this clockwise motion and feel fairly confident about the brush strokes and in control. But then at the bottom there's a place where I lose the kind of control of the brush a little bit, and I find it a little bit more awkward at that angle. That's useful information for me that I can use in future paintings to know that my hand doesn't like being in that position. So I could either move my paper, or I could go with it and just say, okay, that's a place where I can add a little bit more organicness into the painting. For our second exercise today, I'm switching to this flat brush, although you could do with a round brush if you don't have one, but the flat brush has got a square end and it allows you to get a kind of really nice uniform stripe. And I am going to play with making them rounded and trying to keep them nice and even. And I'm essentially playing a game of watercolour snake, where I'm drawing a long snaking shape that's going to weave in and around the page, wiggling backwards and forwards. And my goal is to get it back to the starting point without touching itself and without leaving any kind of blank space on the page. To get a nice curving line with this flat brush, I'm going to have to kind of wiggle it backwards and forwards, kind of twiddling it between my fingers as I move and turning my hand into some really awkward positions. So that's the challenge with this one, is how to keep that nice smooth line, make it look uniform, although you can see I'm lifting and dipping and getting new colours of paint and then getting some more water, making sure it all kind of spreads nicely. But I'm also trying lots of different hand positions and wrist positions to try and get that kind of nice smooth curving line on the page. So of course you can do this in any set of colours that you like. It'd be really interesting to do a kind of a whole rainbow where you go through from kind of one side of the rainbow and then kind of keep looping around, trying to match the colours up. For this I'm just kind of dipping randomly into the colours that I've got pre-mixed in my palette. And as I said before, they do kind of flow into one another. So you do get kind of all of those soft in-between intermediate colours, which I really love. So I'm going from, I've got a kind of creamy colour which is buff titanium, and then I'm going through yellow. I'm using Quinacridone gold, which is a really rich kind of egg yolky yellow. I've got an orange and magenta, which again is a Quinacridone magenta. You can tell I like these Quinacridone colours. They're really vibrant and pigmented. The purpley colour that I'm using here is actually called Moonglow, and it's a very granulating colour, which means that it gets a lot of little kind of particles left on the surface when it dries, which adds a kind of an interest to it. But I don't really want it to be really vibrant and purple. It's actually more of a kind of a grey with a purple tinge, which is why I really like it. I don't have to work too hard to kind of tone it down. But you could just use any kind of purpley, violet-y colour, or even add a little bit of blue into your pink, and you'll get a kind of nice violet-y tinge to it. As I go with this, the challenge becomes trying to fill the page, not leave any kind of big obvious gaps, but also trying to keep it nice and smooth and flowing, and not have any kind of too awkward shapes and angles, although there are a few at the end. As the page gets fuller and fuller, it becomes harder and harder to fill. And what I want to do is to get back to the centre, to where I started, and meet up with the the strand that I started with, so I've got kind of one continuous shape. But if you don't make it, it won't be the end of the world, and you'll still end up with something that looks kind of cool and interesting. For my final one, I want to play with stripes again, but this time I want to play with different kind of widths of stripes, and I want to see how wide a stripe I can make with the paintbrush that I'm using, which is a size 6, so it's kind of a medium, small to medium sized brush. And I start out by using the paintbrush kind of on its side rather than on its end, and that kind of covers a lot more area, but it is a little bit harder to control. I've done the first stripe in a colour, and then the second one with my slightly dirty water. And then add in another stripe along the bottom, which is going into the watery area that I've painted. So I've painted kind of quite dry paint into a wet area on the pink stripe there. And that should give me some variations when it's drying. So I've painted a thinner orange stripe in the kind of the usual way that you'd paint, kind of dragging the brush along the page. And then I've used the very tip to create some little kind of scallopy petal shapes. For the stripe below that, I want to mirror those petal shapes, but leave a little white gap so that they're really distinct and they don't just totally disappear. And then straighten off the bottom of the stripe so that the next one down starts with a kind of straight edge. I think I'll put a couple of areas of kind of more detailed pattern into this page of stripes just to make it look a little bit more interesting. You can also go in when it's dry and add more detail later. And you can go in with pens, and yeah, there's no end of things you can do with this. As I'm laying down the stripes on the kind of with the side of my brush, it always kind of loads more paint at the beginning of the stripe. So going backwards and forwards across it a few times should give me a more even blend, and it should dry more evenly, in contrast to some of those areas where I want it to dry unevenly. So as I go down the page, I'm practicing different ways of making stripes, making them all one colour, making them two-tone, making them some of them thicker, some of them thinner. For a second slightly more detailed line, I'm putting down a row of triangles, and I'm starting by making these just really roughly. And you can see they're a little bit blobby. But if I can keep them still wet, I can go into them and even them up. So ones that are a bit smaller I can make bigger, and ones where I've got little kind of blobby edges on, I can use the very tip of my brush to make them look more pointy. They don't need to be too perfect though. A little bit of character is what we're going for. And then the second row I'm going to go for a very pale and watery colour for my kind of rough shapes, rough triangle shapes. And then use a bit of a stronger colour just on the very point of my brush to kind of outline them. And that should give me a variation in colour. It should be kind of like darker on the outside and lighter on the centre. So I hope you enjoy doing these exercises. There are lots of different ways of using your brush and then using different shaped brushes and different sized brushes to get different effects. It'd be really interesting to try these again with a different size brush and see what the differences are. See which ones you feel most comfortable with. and see what effects you can get by using different sized and shaped brushes. So if you give any of these a go, I'd love to see what you do with them. You can always post your work to Instagram and tag me at LouRachelDavis. That's one way of getting me to see it. I do love seeing what you've made, and I love that you share them with me. So thank you for that. There won't be a video next week because I'm going to be away, but then after that I'm going to be back with a new focus for autumn, and yeah, you can hear more about that in September. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks very much. Bye bye.